Good morning. Hello, everybody. So nice to see you here back at our old stomping grounds, the Chilmar Community Center. I want to welcome everybody to the Saturday morning events in Tent 2 for the Martha's Vineyard Book Festival 2021 Summer Series. Thank you all for coming and for your support of this series. The book festival is so happy to be bringing back in-person events, and we are mindful of the risks that remain and are taking precautions and keeping all of our events outside, avoiding book signings, requiring vaccinations, etc. So just do what you have to do to be safe, and hopefully we will keep each other safe. Okay. Water is available throughout the day at the tent entrance and at the check-in information tent, and there are lunch, snacks, and drinks available for sale at the check-in and information tent. Speaking of the check-in and information tent, if any of you might have left keys for a Jeep when you checked in, so only Jeep owners in this crowd need to say, oh my God, were those my keys? If they were, they're at the check-in tent waiting for you. Okay. When the event is over, we are encouraging all members of the audience to buy the author's book at the book tent if you did not already purchase it with your ticket. This is how we support our authors, our programming, and independent booksellers. Books are pre-signed with book plates. In a second, I'm going to introduce our speaker and the moderator, and there will be questions, and you will be asked at a certain point if you have questions. If you don't, I have been informed that the conversation up front will continue without questions until you have questions. There are 2 mics for questions on either side of the main grouping here. And so, again, thank you for coming, and now let me introduce our speakers. Our moderator, is that the right word, moderator? Yes. Yeah, okay, moderator. Angela Ards is an associate professor of English and journalism at Boston College. She received her MA in African American Studies from UCLA and her PhD in English from Princeton. Her first book, Words of Witness, Contemporary Black Women's Autobiography in the Post-Brown Era, examines how writers use the traditional civil rights movement narrative to craft life stories. Angela is also a writer and a journalist. Her essays and reviews have appeared in Time, The Village Voice, Essence, the LA Times Book Review. She has also been widely anthologized with chapters in That's the Joint, The Hip Hop Studies Reader, Burning All Illusions, Writing from the Nation on Race. So we have an extremely accomplished moderator, and now our author, Sadeqa Johnson. We do not have many novelists at this year's book festival, but after reading Sadeqa Johnson's Yellow Wife, the festival was compelled to invite her to discuss her latest book, Yellow Wife, which is a harrowing tale rooted in history of an enslaved woman in Virginia beginning in the 1850s. Sadeqa has written 4 other novels. Her accolades include the National Book Club Award, the USA Best Book Award for Best Fiction. She is a Conbilio Fellow and board member of the James River Writers. And she is very young. I just want to comment on that for all these awards. The reviews for Yellow Wife include adjectives such as wholly engrossing, exquisitely researched, heartbreaking, richly crafted, unsparing, thought-provoking, and gorgeous. Just to say a few nice words here. NPR called the novel a challenging read but beautifully told. Yellow Wife doesn't pull any punches in telling its story about this painful period in American history. However, with a central character who is more than up to the task, this thought-provoking, well-paced tale brims with heart and intelligence. And with that, I turn this over to our moderator and our speaker. Thank you so much for being here.
So good morning, everyone. It's so good to be here with all of you and to be here at the book festival. I want to thank the organizers for having us. And I'm really excited to be in conversation with Sadeqa, author of Yellow Wife, a really mesmerizing tale. As Abby said, it's deeply rooted in history, but I also want to say it's deeply rooted in her brilliant imagination and in the African American literary tradition, some themes that I hope we talk about today. But before we start, Right, Sadeqa is going to give us just a very short reading so we can have the words of the novel in the air.
Are you guys good with that? Yes. Okay. All right. Well, thank you. I echo all of that. Thanks. So thank you all for being here. And so this is my novel, Yellow Wife. It is my fourth novel, but it's my first historical fiction. So I'm just going to read a little bit just so you guys get a feel for it. And I'll just start right from the beginning. If anybody has their copy, some people like to follow along. Part 1, Bell Plantation, Charles City, Virginia, 1850. Mama believed that the full moon was the most fertile night of the month, and that everything she touched held God's power. Each full moon, she dragged me out in the middle of the night with her to hunt for roots, plants, seedlings, and rare blossoms to use for healing. I did not understand why God's power could not be found during daylight hours, and as I trudged behind her, the March cold overwhelmed me. Even my thick wool shawl was no match against the country freeze. Fear of the woods made my feet clumsy, and I tripped over fallen sticks, scratched my shins on the spiky brush, and bumped my head on low-hanging branches. Mama, on the other hand, moved with skill and confidence, like the earth parted a path and presented the way for her. Even in the dark, she knew where to stop for herbs and how to avoid the dangerous ones. We had only a small lantern to guide us, and when I asked how she knew where things grew, she responded, "My gut be my light." We slipped through the thicket, past the drafty cabins where the field hands slept on pallets stuffed with hay and husk. I heard a dry cough and a low whine from a hungry baby. Farther down toward the James River, we traveled through the clearing where we met on church for Sundays. Then over the hill and along the cemetery, peppered with sticks to honor our dead. As we traveled deeper into the woods of the plantation, the thick forest blocked the light of the moon. I could hear the growls and grunts of unseen animals and fretted over running into hungry raccoons or red foxes or stepping on a poisonous snake. I tried to clear the worry from my mind as the land flattened out, but then something pricked my ankle. Before I could call out, Mama stopped suddenly and reached for my hand. "This here's a black walnut tree. Grow deep in the woods, so you gotta know where to look. Cure for most everything. Ever unsure, come seek this tree." Mama handed me the lantern, then pulled a blade from her satchel and severed a piece of bark. She brought it to her nose and ran her tongue along the inside of it. "Her stain anything it touch. After we make a tea for Rachel, rest we use to dye those sheets for the nursery. Just hoping we ain't too late to save that girl." Mama reached into her bag and pulled out a red ribbon. "Gone and mark it, so it'll be easy for you to find when you come without me." I reached up and tied the ribbon on a skinny twig, knowing I had no intention of roaming these woods without my mama.
So let's start with genre. You say it's a historical novel, your first. It's based in real history, real events for real people. Can you hear me? So we're going to start with genre and think about that it's a historical. Not yet here. Closer to my mouth. Is this working better? Let's try this. So it's a historical novel based on real events, real people. Tell us two things. So tell us how you discovered the story, but then what lingering, I don't know what it might be this pen, you think? You think it's my iPad? Ooh, but I definitely need those questions. Okay. What about, that's a little better. There we go. Thank you. Thank you. So the first question is a genre question. It's a historical novel based on real people, real events. Tell us, one, how you discovered that story, and then two, what lingering thoughts or questions about that story made you want to turn it into a novel?
My husband and I raised our children in New Jersey. And I was standing in our kitchen in Springfield, New Jersey in 2015. And I heard a voice that said, move. Now, we were already moving, but the voice was like, move, like move out of the state. And I couldn't really understand why, but it happened at a time when my husband just happened to be in Virginia. And we just talked about it, and the next thing you know, 2 weeks later, we're in Central Virginia looking for a house. By March, we were back again. By June of 2015, we were all moved in. There was no rhyme or reason. There was no job. We just did it. 9 months later, I had some friends from New Jersey come down to visit us, and we were just looking for an activity that we could do with their kids and our kids, and someone suggested that we take a walk along the Richmond Slave Trail. The Richmond Slave Trail was put into place in 2016, and there's 17 markers along the trail. It runs along the James River, and it talks about what it was like for the enslaved people as they came into Richmond. And so we had the kids take turns reading the different markers. And we got to the marker that talked about the Lumpkin's jail. And it was described as a punishing center and holding site for enslaved people. Between 1845 and 1865, over 200,000 enslaved people passed through this particular jail. I had not even known that jails like this existed. So something right there said, Sadeqa, pay attention. And they described the owner, Robert Lumpkin, as a very cruel man. And he was so cruel that in addition to being a traitor, he was known as the person, if you wanted to make an example out of your enslaved person, you sent them to the Lumpkin's jail so that they would receive the highest mark of punishment. But the contradiction was that he was married to a black woman, and her name was Mary Lumpkin. And they said while he was a cruel man, with her and the 5 children they had together, he was kind and he was considerate. So the first thing I started to think was, what was life like for Mary Lumpkin? We know that women like her did not have any agency over their lives. And so my first thought was this a marriage of survival? You know, did she love him? Was it a marriage of convenience? And what was it like for those 5 children that they raised on a half acre of land, where if I could just paint the picture for you, a half acre of land, there was this jail that was described as one of the most smelly places on earth. They never cleaned it. They packed the enslaved people in, and so everything you can imagine was happening on this jail. You could smell it for blocks and blocks before you even came upon the jail. There was the tavern where he used to make business transactions, and it was also a hotel, although I don't know who would want to stay there, but it was also a hotel. And then there were the outhouses, the kitchen house, and then there was the house that they raised these 5 children in. And every day they were subjected to life of what happened during slavery. And so what did she tell her children as her fellow enslaved people were being separated from their families and beaten and tortured? And so that was kind of what was swirling around in my head. We continued along the trail, and the trail is about 2.5 miles, but we had our children with us, and so they're like, we're tired of walking. Can we go? Is this it? Can we leave? And I was thinking, now I need to see, the very end of the trail was the site of the Lumpkin's jail. So now I need to see that. So we get in the car and we drive to the site. And in Richmond right now, it's a parking lot with a cottage on it and some information about the Lumpkin's jail. But adjacent to it, there's a big field that has been preserved as the sacred African burial ground. And what I learned about this ground was that when the enslaved people died at the Lumpkin's jail, there was no ceremony. They literally waited and let the bodies pile up, and then they shoved them in the ground. And so now this is preserved land in Richmond, and we walked across the land, and the friend that I was with, he started to pretend as if he was playing the African drums, because I don't know if you've ever been somewhere where you could just feel this energy, like there's something going on here. And he picked up on it. And so he's pretending to play the African drums. And he's like, I feel like there's some kind of energy here. And so the kids, they start dancing and we're all moving. And I'm like, this feels like a celebratory moment. It feels like a coming home. I felt like the ancestors were waiting for us. And then my next thought was, I think the ancestors were waiting for me. They want me to tell their story. And that thought invigorated me and scared me to death, all at the same time. And I went home, and I feel like they all got in the car with me. And they stayed, and they kept saying, Google this, look up this, find this. And that's what I did, and that was kind of the beginning of the research for Yellow Wife.
I want to pick up on that, honoring the ancestors that you wanted to do, because you wrote about that in your author's note, right? What did it mean to honor the ancestors in writing this novel? What was that?
In honoring the ancestors, for me, it was a matter of trying to capture as many stories as possible. So while I was researching Mary Lumpkins, unfortunately, women like her have been blotted from our history. And so I could find bits and pieces of her, but I found bits and pieces of a lot of people. And so I thought, how can I fit them in the story so that I'm telling the story of Mary Lumpkin, but I'm telling everyone's story? So one of the things that I did was that all of the names in the book came off of slave ledgers. So Phoebe, I'll give you a quick story about her name. The characters will tell you that that's not their name. I went through 3 or 4 names, and it just was like, that's not my name. And I took my daughters to a plantation in Charles City, Virginia. It was one of the first plantations we went to. And I was very disappointed because we went through the entire presentation. We walked through the house. The curator was telling us about the art and the artifacts and the people who lived in the house. But at no point did he mention the enslaved people who took care of the property or took care of the house. And so after the 45-minute presentation, I said, so what about the enslaved people? And he said, well, if you go to the kitchen house, you'll find information about them. And so I did, and they had on the wall a slave ledger. And it was there that I saw the name Phoebe spelled with a Y. And I got that little ding that happens, and it says, oh, that's her name, Phoebe. And when I was writing the first chapter, when Phoebe's mother calls to her, all of a sudden she called her Dolores. And I thought, ooh, Dolores must be her middle name. That is the way her mother claims her as her own, because as an enslaved woman, it's not much that you can claim as your own. So by calling her Dolores, that was her mother claiming her. And then Brown, so before my maternal grandmother passed away, she had sketched out a family tree for me. And I remember, and it was like on the back of a menu, we were just having a quick conversation, and she sketched it out. And she said, oh, your Aunt Viney Brown, she was a tough cookie. She said she didn't take no stuff off of nobody. And I thought, oh, Viney Brown needs to be in my story. And so I made her Phoebe's great-grandmother, and so Phoebe Dolores Brown. So that was a way of me trying to honor as many people as possible with the book.
Love that. So this book has been critically acclaimed for so many reasons, but especially because it is so well crafted. You tell a story about a difficult period in our history with unflinching honesty, but you make it a mesmerizing read. This is not your first rodeo. You've written 3 other books. Tell us how those earlier works helped you write this novel.
Wow. So it's not my first rodeo, although most people say, oh my gosh, this is your first book. I'm like, this is just the first book that you knew about. But I've been at this for a very long time. I started off in publishing. I was a publicist for a few years. I worked at Scholastic Books. I worked on the Harry Potter books, which was awesome. And then I worked in adult publishing for a while. And it was there that I was kind of writing my first novel, which is called Love in a CarryOn Bag. And it was a long-distance love story. Ha, ha, ha. And I was writing it every day on the train between New York and Philadelphia, between New York and New Jersey. I grew up in Philadelphia, so I was traveling back and forth. And I thought that it was going to be a 1, 2, 3 thing. So I got married, and I had my son, and I said to my husband, I said, okay, so this is what's going to happen. I'm going to have this baby. I'm going to publish this book, and I'll be a New York Times bestseller, right? So everything is going to be fine. Don't worry about it. I had the baby. I got an agent. She took my book to market. 10 editors told me no. And so I was absolutely devastated and could not get out of it. But my husband and I talked about it, and he suggested that we just start our own publishing company. What do we need from the big publishing company? And I said, well, we need an editor. And he said, well, let's just hire an editor. And it was the moment I said yes to it, everything I needed in the world just kind of came. And I was the sales manager, so I would call up the bookstores and pretend to be someone else. I used a fake name and said, I have this great book, Love in a CarryOn Bag. We need to get this book in the stores. And they're like, okay, send me a couple of copies. So we did everything we could do. And luckily, I won the Phyllis Wheatley Award for that book. So my editor on that first book then became my agent. And we went back to the publishing house, because that was the dream for me. I worked in publishing. I knew what it was like. I had been behind the curtain. I knew this is what I wanted. So we went back to the publishing house, and I had 3 offers from 3 different publishing companies. So I went from the girl that nobody wanted to publish to I had 3 offers now. And those were all contemporary fiction. So when I got the story of Yellow Wife, it was scary, because while I enjoyed reading those type of books, I grew up reading Jubilee by Margaret Walker, and I loved Winch by Dolan Perkins Valdez. I loved reading about history and about slavery, because I wanted to understand what happened. I needed to know. But never did I think that meant I was going to write that sort of book. I didn't think I was qualified. But I had a friend. I was working on the research, and I could see the story starting to come together, but I was terrified. So I had a friend come over to my house, and she's asking me, what's next? What are you working on? So I'm telling her all of this information I've amassed on this book. And I said, but I am utterly scared. And she said, Sadeqa, the thing that scares you most is what you're supposed to be doing next. And that just gave me permission to just say, give it a try.
Oh, I love it. Okay, so at this author's note again, which clearly you see I love, it details the history, the research you did for this book, right? And so the reviewers are really, one of the things they mention and praise is how well researched this book is, the historical scholarship that you read and the archival record. As a teacher of African American literature, what I really appreciate is how much it resonates with the slave narratives and with these contemporary novels about slavery. So I was reading in that note that you actually did read some classic slave narratives, like Frederick Douglass's 1845 narrative. You read Harriet Jacobs's narrative, 1861, which was the first slave narrative, very popular one by a Black woman. How did they inform how you told this story?
I don't know that I could have written the book without that information. I really leaned heavily on slave narratives, because it's one thing when you read a textbook and it says, well, this is what happened, and that's what happened, and that's what happened. It's another thing when you get a bird's eye view from a person who had actually endured it. The story is going to be completely and utterly different. Another book that I leaned heavily on was 50 Years a Slave by Charles Ball. And he was an enslaved man who escaped from slavery twice. So his first time was by foot. And I went along his journey, and it was amazing, but it was sickening, but it was beautiful, but it was horrifying, all at one time. And I thought, I need to get all of those elements in Yellow Wife, because that's the way it happened. So I used his book a lot as well. All of the scenes in the book, while I used a lot of my imagination, most of the horrifying scenes actually really happened. It was just me changing it and making it fit in the story. But all of it happened.
One of the things, a theme of the slave narrative is this idea of freedom, right? Getting your freedom. But for the male writers, it's usually just physical freedom, right? That's what they're thinking about. But because the women writers, like Harriet Jacobs, often weren't able to escape for all kinds of reasons, usually associated with their gender, they couldn't leave and had to think of freedom in larger, more expansive ways. And that does happen, not to give too much away, but that does happen in this text. Phoebe is promised freedom at 18 and doesn't receive it. And so I was wondering for you, because you do have some moments of enduring Black humanity, what's freedom for Phoebe? How does she finally achieve that? Or does she, do you think?
I think when the story opens, freedom for Phoebe is defined by her own mother. Her mother's name is Ruth, and she is the medicine woman of the plantation, and she's also the seamstress. They work in the loom house together. And she tells Phoebe from a very young age, you are a slave in name, but never in your mind, child. And it is something that she repeats to her over and over. And just that little bit of information, I think, gives Phoebe a dream. It gives her a hope. And so everything that Phoebe's mother, Ruth, does is to set her daughter up for freedom. And that includes having a relationship with the master, because she feels and she believes that he is the one who could deliver freedom for her daughter. And she trusts and she believes that because she doesn't have anything else to trust and believe in. So when Phoebe then does not receive the promise and finds herself thrust into the bowels of slavery, and she ends up at the jail, freedom looks very different for her when she begins to have children. And so she then becomes the mama in the story, where freedom for her is freedom for her children.
Can I talk to you or ask you a little bit about her artistic side, right? Her piano playing and her love of literature. How does that play?
That was so gratifying for me to give her. So all of my first novel, Love in a CarryOn Bag, the main character was a trumpet player. And I realized I really love writing music. I played piano for like a brief period when I was a kid. And I don't know, I think, yeah, you do need to start your kids young because it does carry on. So even though I don't play now, I'm always feeling the music. And music plays a really big part. And when I'm writing a book, I almost have sort of a soundtrack for every section of the book. So when I was writing Phoebe and I was writing her playing the piano, I was always listening to Chopin. And that was kind of my background music the whole time, or someone like him. But it's wonderful for me to write that. And because I'm a lover of books, I think most writers like to write about characters who like to read books. I find it's a common theme throughout a lot of the books I like. And so it was very easy for me to give that to her. But being an enslaved woman, that was a privilege that most did not have. And so Phoebe was very lucky that the master's sister never had children and never got married and took her on sort of as a pet project. And so she educated her and she taught her to play and how to read and write and arithmetic.
Right. As you were saying that, again, I'm sorry, the professor in me, but it made me think of the slave narrative tradition and this trope of literacy as freedom. Literacy musically, literacy in terms of how you're able to read, and that's it's there in your book.
Yeah, I was going to say the piano for Phoebe actually was a form of freedom. And so whenever she got to, because sometimes it was denied from her.
Right.
And so the moments that she did get to play piano, she would even say to herself, this must be what freedom feels like, because she could get lost in the music and get lost between the keys.
Yeah. So you mentioned Jubilee, right? You mentioned Winch, these contemporary novels about slavery. Yours is different, but in conversation with them. What do you think you are building on, adding to?
I hope I'm adding to the conversation, because those books were ones that really literally changed my life. Jubilee by Margaret Walker, when I was a kid, I read that. And then when I read Winch by Dolan Perkins Valdez, I immediately started reading it a second time, because I was so enamored by the storytelling, but also the story itself. And just being a lover of wanting to, I just always wanted to know. I wanted to understand. And those books really informed that for me. And so when I sat down to write Yellow Wife, I thought if I was writing my own kind of tagline, it would be like, if you love Jubilee and Winch, then you're absolutely going to love Yellow Wife,
They didn't go for that.
They didn't let me write my own tagline.
I mean, I have more questions, but I am going to open it up now if people have questions. Can you go to the mic, please?
Hi, I have a question. Thank you so much. This conversation has been so enriching, and thank you, both of you together. I want to, since we're on talking about what the publishers let you do or not let you do, I'm interested in the cover and how sort of you decided on it and how much input you had in that.
So this is the cover of Yellow Wife, and I was very fortunate that my publishing house brought me in from the beginning and that I was able to contribute to the conversation on the book. One of the things that I added, if you look closely at the bottom of the cover, there is the city of Richmond going through her dress. And that was something that I thought was very important to kind of bring the reader in to where we were. But we got down to 2 covers, and this was the one that I wanted. And they said, okay, we'll take it to the sales team. And unanimously, sales was like, this is it.
Here?
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
So first of all, I read the book and I loved it. And sorry, I was really touched by it. But what I wanted to ask you is along the lines of the other question, which is how did you arrive at that title, and are you happy with it?
Thank you. Yellow Wife, the title came to me when I was doing some research. I came across Robert Lumpkin, who is the inspiration behind the jailer in the story. I came across a portion of his will, and he said in his will, I leave my property and my fortune to my yellow wife. And he was referring to Mary Lumpkin. And then he had some other things that he said, I leave to my black concubine. And in my story, that would have been Sissy. And so that was the way he separated his property, yellow wife and black concubine. And I thought, oh, that's a good frame for the book. And I am happy. I'm happy that it stuck, because sometimes we come up with titles, and once it gets to the publisher, they're like, yeah, no. But I'm happy that it stuck.
Thank you.
I'm just kind of wondering about the process of finding an agent, and what's the best way of going about that and pitching to the agents, and how many agents you have to go through to find the right one.
My story is sort of unique when it comes to agents, because my first agent I met when I was working in publishing. And then when I self-published my first book, my editor was actually going to transition into being an agent, and so she brought me along with her. I did pitch a few agents in between. I would say a good query letter is everything. So I would definitely make sure that your query letter is very tight. Find authors who are like you and say, if you love Kimberly Lawson Roby, then you would love Sadeqa Johnson. Things like that, so that they have a picture of what you're writing. And just make sure your manuscript is really tight. Before I would send it to looking for an agent, I would have a professional editor take a look at it, because the competition these days is so tight. Like when my editor would say that when she got Yellow Wife, it was 90% done. That's what she would say. And that's because I had worked it so much before she even saw it that it was like an automatic yeah.
And just one more thing before I hand it off to the next person. What's the writing process like for you? How do you find the time to sit down and write a novel? Is it like set hours per day, or is it like more of like a fluid sort of thing?
Mm-hmm. When I was first starting off, I had really young kids, so I would write during their nap time. I always try to shoot for 2 hours a day, but if you're just beginning your writing process, don't put that much pressure on yourself. 10 minutes is fine. Start with 10 minutes, and then before you know it, it's 30 minutes. But I would always try and get in at least 2 hours a day. Now it depends on where I am in the story, so it will vary between like 2 to 6 hours a day for me.
All right.
And mornings, I'm a morning person, and I feel like I need to use that fresh brain, because once I start checking email and doing other things like that, the story gets a little bit quieter in my head. But when I use that fresh brain, it's like the characters are right there talking to me.
Yeah. I just transitioned into a morning person, so yeah. So just trying to find the work and find the time each day. So
Good luck.
Good
I wish
luck.
you all the luck.
thank you, Shaniqua.
We have someone here? Okay.
Is there no? Oh, thank you. Hi, a quick question. I really like the herb information and the medicinal information that was in the book, woven through. Where did you get that?
I think if I was born at a different time, I would have been the medicinal woman. I would have been the herbologist, but I wasn't. I was born in the 70s, and my mom gave me Tylenol. But I think if that was me, that would have been my job. Like, I would have been the one figuring out how to cure people. I would have been the midwife. So I've always been kind of drawn to that. So it was very satisfying for me to be able to live vicariously through Ruth. And I just did research on medication that they use. You know, most of the enslaved people did not trust Western medicine, and so they would cure themselves. And I read a couple of lines, and I think I put it in the book, where one of the characters says he doesn't know anything about curing any field hands because they felt that their medicine was a little bit different than some of the Western medicines. And so it was a journey of research, but it also made sense, and it felt good to be able to put that on the page for me. Thank you.
So you were probably writing, I guess, before COVID, but I'm curious about doing your historical research. Were you able to do a lot on the internet, and is that trustworthy? And if you also have children, I realize it might be hard to go to the actual places or look at documents. So I'm curious about your research process.
Luckily for me, Yellow Wife was mostly finished. I sold the book in October 2019. So the book was pretty done before COVID. So most of my edits happened in COVID, and that didn't require a lot of research. But just to begin, I started with the internet just because it was like, I'm not even sure if I'm writing this book. So let me just see what I can find. And so I Googled, and there were a lot of articles that I found online. But from there, I thought, I need to go out. And so I went to a few plantations. I really had to concentrate on Virginia slavery because it is very different from state to state. It was even different from Charles City to Richmond. And in the book, I really tried to make that transition for the reader so that they could see, like, it's only a 45-minute drive, but during that time, it was like a world of difference. So I went to various plantations, including Booker T. Washington's plantation is in Virginia. And that one I happened by accident. I was driving down the road, and it was like Booker T. Washington's plantation. And I was like, okay, I better stop. And so I went, and in the beginning of the book, there's a bell that rings that signals to them, the enslaved people know that each ring of the bell means something different. Well, when I stopped on Booker T. Washington's plantation, there was this beautiful bell hanging. And I was standing under it, and I was taking pictures, and I was like, yeah, this needs to be in the story. And then when I got home, it was natural that it just fit in the story. And so I have to go out and feel it, smell it, touch it in order to bring all of that sensory. I try and be like a full sensory writer so that you could get all of that as you're reading the book. And so going out was one of those things. I'm very fortunate that I live very close to Richmond. I'm south of Richmond, about like 15, 20 minutes. So the Library of Virginia is in Richmond. So the librarians were great about helping me find like periodicals and essays and things, newspaper clippings that were written at that time. And that's where I really discovered some of the other, so there are a lot of people in the story who I kept their name. So like Nathaniel Culver was the Baptist minister. I was able to find things about him. And some of the other wives, some of the other yellow wives were actual people that I was able to find a paragraph here or a sentence there, and then I would just embellish.
I'll ask more questions until there are more from the audience. So with all of the contemporary stories about slavery right now, there's this question that's come up about the representation of slavery, right, in film and in fiction. What is too much? What is overwhelming? Your book, as beautiful as it is sometimes difficult to read, and I imagine it must have been very difficult to write. Tell us about your choice to give us this kind of unflinching graphic picture of slavery.
It was very important to me that if I was going to tell the story, that I had to tell the truth. and I had to tell the whole truth. Because for me, as I was reading these stories and learning about the people who had gone through this portion of history, it happened, right? Like it actually really did happen. And so my thought process was always that if our ancestors, and when I was writing the book, I was writing it for everyone because, slavery is our American history, right? So we stand on the shoulders of these men and women who endured, who built this country for us. And as I was reading and researching, my thought process was if they could endure it, the very least I could do was write about it. The very least I could do was write about it. And then if I could write about it, then surely people could read about it because it happened.
Yes, that's clap-worthy. But I'm also thinking what you said about, I think it was Charles Ball, who said, yeah, there was a lot of horrific pain, but then there was like this enduring humanity as well. And that is also in your book. And so many moments. So I'm wondering, do you have a favorite part?
Well, sometimes people say, do you have a favorite book out of your 4 books? And I'm like, that's like asking me to choose between my children, right? But I have a lot of scenes. I love writing about love. So even though this is a harrowing story, there is a very strong undercurrent of love, and Phoebe has a true love in the story. His name is Essex Henry, and all of those scenes were so tender and so near and so dear to my heart that they're like a little bit of light in the darkness. So I would say the love that flowed through the story was definitely endearing for me.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what's the next question I wanted to ask you? Oh, I know. Another genre in African American literature that your text is engaged with is the passing novel, novels of people of mixed race ancestry. And usually authors wrote those novels. I'm thinking James Weldon Johnson, Nella Larsen's Passing, which is a film now. Showing tonight at the film, yes. And these authors wrote these novels with these mixed race characters to get the country, all people across the color line, to think about race relations at that moment, right? And so I was wondering, was there something you wanted readers to get away from Phoebe's story, black and white?
That's a really good question. And honestly, the reason why Phoebe was mulatto was because Mary Lumpkins was mulatto. And really that was the way the story had come to me. So it wasn't a conscious choice, but as I was writing the story, I did realize that she did have certain privileges that others would not have if they were not mixed raced. And so it was also important for me to make sure that that was well documented so that you would see the difference. At the beginning of the book, I talk a little bit about the hierarchy of what it was like on the plantation and, where people stood when they even came to the back of the house to get an announcement from the master. There was a hierarchy. And so showing that was important to me because, again, that's the way it was.
Lovely. We'll have this question here.
So this is more of a language question. So at one point in your research, do you have to, when writing a historical novel, do you have to think about how people would speak back in those days, and you have to mimic how that plays out to have it be more believable, more immersive?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that was something that in the beginning was very tricky for me, was figuring out the way that they spoke. And reading those slave narratives informed it. I also went back and studied Zora Neale Hurston, who was just a master at writing dialect. And I went through Their Eyes Were Watching God, and I wrote down certain sentences. And then I thought, how do I make this work for Yellow Wife in a way that everybody can read it and receive it, but I'm not losing the culture? And that was a tricky line. And that's why you have great editors, so as my book was going through edits, sometimes they would say, dial it back just a little bit, give us enough so that we know where we are, we get the feel of it, but it's not hard for the reader to read at the same time. So that was definitely something. The other thing that happens for me when I'm writing is that eventually the characters start speaking to me. And I would say that is the greatest gift of being a writer. And I probably sound a little crazy, but I'm walking around with all these characters in my head. And so they speak a certain way to me as I slip into, I like to say I slip into like a portal. And as I go in, they're talking to me. And when I'm writing it, when I go back to read it again, they're saying, that's not right. And then I'm changing it as I go. So the biggest thing as a writer, you have to be able to like trust your gut and write what you're hearing. I often look at myself as the conduit. Like the story is out there. The story wants to be told. I just happen to be the person who was chosen to tell the story. So I could just be the typist and get it down and let the characters come through me and tell the story they want to tell. So that's really helpful when it comes to dialogue as well.
Thanks, Sadeqa.
You're welcome.
Let's see how. Oh, okay. I'm just trying to figure out how to frame this question. I guess a few years ago, I was doing some research and I read an article about William Styron and the Confessions of Nat Turner, and it talked about how there was so much criticism of him as a white man writing that book. And at the time, it sort of almost hurt me to my core, in part because as a child, that was such an important book in my life. And I was just wondering, sort of how you feel about the sort of debate or controversy around, who's an imposter, who has the right to write about somebody who looks different or perhaps has a different experience. And as somebody, I was an African studies major in college in the 70s, and I lived in Kenya, and I started reading African American literature when I was like 12, and so and I don't look like you, and so I feel like I want to be welcomed. So I'm just wondering how you feel about that.
What do you mean you don't look like me? I thought we were cousins. So for me, I feel very strongly about when I'm writing something, it has to hit me in my core. Writing Yellow Wife felt right to me because it felt like it was a part of my DNA. It felt like it was a part of my makeup. It felt like I could access that story very easily. And so that's what I chose to write about. But I'm also very interested in this, when you listen to the news and you hear about these children who get left at the border from some of the Spanish-speaking countries, and that rips at my core. But even though it does, I don't feel qualified to write it. I personally don't. But I also love The Kitchen House, which was another book that really informed my writing. And Kathleen Grisham is a white woman from Canada.
Yeah.
And she said when she didn't know why she was writing that book. She got called to write it. She was on the land, and she was at the well. I forget the exact story, so I don't want to butcher it, but it was a calling for her. So I think as writers, we have to make choices of, are we doing it because we feel called to it? Is it something in our gut and our makeup that's saying, this is the story that's for you? Or are we doing what's popular, right? And I think it's a difference between those two things.
Great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So to go back to the passing thing real quickly, at the end of the novel, I'm not going to tell you the end, but we know that Phoebe has 5 children, and 2 of them are freed and pass into whiteness, right? They become white. But she has a younger child, and that's in the story because that actually happened, right? And then the 5th child, Kathleen, does not pass. She chooses not to pass. And I didn't know. I was like, was that true to Mary Lumpkin's story, or was that a character you added?
So what I knew about Mary Lumpkin as I was writing the story was that she came to the jail as a child. And essentially the owner, Robert Lumpkin, it was rape. She was young. She was maybe 13 when she had her first child. And that they had 5 children together. And when the Civil War came and they were free, he had passed away. And Robert Lumpkin tried to leave Richmond on a train, and he took 50 enslaved people and shackled them and tried to get on a train in Danville, Virginia. When he got to the train was full, so they wouldn't let him on. And so they had to free those 50 slaves, and a year later he dies of cholera. So Mary Lumpkin then owns the jail, and she is walking through Richmond, and she comes across a Baptist minister. His name is Nathaniel Culver. and he was looking for a place to start a school for the freemen to teach them to read and to write and about religion. And so she leases the Lumpkins jail to him, and it goes from being called the Devil's Half Acre to God's Half Acre. So there was some redemption in the jail in Mary Lumpkin's life. She then goes on to New Orleans, where she opens a restaurant, and it says that she has one child with her, and that two of her girls go up to Ipswich, Massachusetts, which I don't know if anybody, I've never been there. Is it near here? Okay. So two of her girls go there, and they pass for white, and they pretty much wipe out their lineage, because not only are they wiping out the fact that their mother was mulatto, but their father, being a trader and the owner of a jail, was also very unsavory at the time. In fact, that is why he was with Mary Lumpkin, because men who were dealing at that level were looked at as the pariahs of the earth. And so no upper echelon white person would marry their children to them. And so that's why there was this whole society of men who traded, who were married to mulatto women and had children. And so what I read was that this one daughter stays with Mary Lumpkin. She goes to Louisiana with her, and then Mary Lumpkin ends up in New Richmond, Ohio, where she dies in 1905, and the one daughter was with her. And so I am not clear if she didn't pass because she was too brown, or if she didn't pass because it was a conscious choice. But I just made it a conscious choice in the book so that we would have two sides of the story.
Lovely. We have one last question. I'll ask. Do we have time for that? So the epigraph, the quotation at the very beginning of the book by abolitionist Wilberforce. I forget what it is, though. Do you have it?
Yeah, I do.
Can you read it out and tell us why that quotation?
So I always have to start with a quote to frame my stories in. It helps me as a writer, but I think it also helps you as a reader. And so the quote was, "You may choose to look the other way, but you can never say again that you didn't know." And that's by William Wilberforce. And that's what I was hoping to accomplish with the book, is that you can never not know what happened once you read the story.
Excellent.
Wow. Fabulous. This is why we come here authors, because now we all have to go buy the book right now over at the tent. Thank you both so much for an incredible panel. How great to have you here and hear it in your voice as I read the book. I hope I get to keep hearing it in your voice. Thanks to everybody. We need to